Hello, and welcome to another episode of Joe and Cat Chats. Today we're recording on January 26th, 2021, and we're talking this week about the environment, which is a great, big, giant subject, but we're going to try to tackle it in an hour. So first things first, though, Joe, how are you?
You know what? I am cold chilling. Everything is crispy and clean. Got my daughter with me for the week. She's hanging out and she's doing her schoolwork and being a good student, just like her father. And it's I don't expect her to get straight A's, but I do expect her to do her work, and I do expect her to study, and I do expect her to be about her business. And in this place, we are about our business. So, and it's good that she's learning that at a young age. That way, when she gets older, instead of potentially going out and partying, she'll say, "Hey, you know what? I got to study this." So it's good. How are you?
No, I'm doing really well. I'm feeling energetic. I feel like spring is finally sort of almost here because the days are getting longer, so that's giving me a little bit more energy, which is nice.
That's awesome. That's wonderful. That's excellent. Yeah. That's excellent. And we got a very intriguing and interesting topic to talk about today. I just want to go ahead and spend a couple of seconds talking about last week. Talking about Joe Biden and his cabinet. Several of the people that we outlined in Joe Biden's cabinet have been appointed or have been chosen for the particular positions. Anthony Blinken is now the Secretary of State. Avril Haines is now the Director of National Intelligence. Janet Yellen has been appointed as the Secretary of the Treasury. So all of these people that we talked about in last week's episode, all of them now have jobs in Washington, D.C., and they are potentially going to do serious damage to the United States. Additionally, there's now a new bill in Washington, D.C. to have Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill instead of Andrew Jackson. I fully support this maneuver. I don't like seeing racists on money. At the same time, the bigger issue is why you and I live in countries that have civil rights heroes. Because if countries didn't have people's rights infringed upon, there wouldn't be a need to have people from the disenfranchised groups to stand up against the patriarchy or the oppressors in order for them to be civil rights heroes in the first place. So if everybody just wasn't racist and just wasn't an asshole and just leave people the hell alone, you wouldn't have civil rights heroes. So I'm not saying that civil rights heroes are a bad thing at all. You know, hell, civil rights heroes are heroes because of what they have done. But if racism and patriarchy and colonialism and imperialism weren't issues in our countries, we wouldn't have the need for civil rights heroes.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And yeah, I think we're going to talk a little bit about activism later in the show because, I mean, we wouldn't be where we are today without these amazing heroes, the civil rights heroes, but they started as activists and they were not liked at all at the time. We prop them up now because history, we learned lessons from those moments in history. And so while I recognize and acknowledge that these people are really important figures in our history, I totally agree. I wish we didn't have to have them as, the heroes. Yeah. I wish we had human rights.
There you go. Because if we had human rights and civil rights, we wouldn't need civil rights heroes. That being said, Canada a couple of years back went ahead and put Viola Desmond on the Canadian $10 bill. And I love the design of the Canadian $10 bill. It's a purple bill and it's actually vertical. So you see Viola Desmond's face vertically like how we are now. And we'll see what happens. We'll see. But moreover, what I'm more interested in, instead of Harriet Tubman's face being on a $20 bill, I am more interested in $20 bills actually being put into my checking account in the form of a stimulus.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm more interested in that because I'm not necessarily I'm not overly interested in whose face is on the bill. I'm more interested in paying my bills.
Yeah, absolutely. And the way to do that oftentimes comes down to well, I mean, economics and industries, and really the system that we run under, which is capitalism. And one of the basic tenets of capitalism is, exploitation of resources. And that's part of what we're going to talk about today. We're talking about, pardon?
A huge part of what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, we're talking about the environment. And so resource extraction is like a huge part of that. And that keeps the economy going so that we can get paid, we can get, tax revenue and beyond. So yeah, while I also really want you to get that stimulus check, just like I want everybody else in both our countries and around the world to get stimulus checks from their governments. I think that the conversation today is really intimately tied to that, even if it's not necessarily as obvious when we talk about some of these concepts.
Correct. I couldn't agree more, and I'm looking forward to a robust and lively conversation with you as well.
Awesome. Yeah, me too. So I guess to start off, let's do what we usually do and define some terms.
Define some terms. Yes.
So what is the environment?
The environment. It's a place where people and plants and animals live. Yeah. It's a place where you live. You live in Vancouver. I live in Carrboro, North Carolina. My mom lives in Baltimore, Maryland. Your mom lives in Airdrie, Alberta. So it's a place where people live, and it's also a place where human beings and plants live. There's an Amazon rainforest. There's the Kootenay region of British Columbia, where there's a whole lot of large trees. There are large rivers like the Nile and the Amazon. So, and these places are known for their vegetation, and there's a lot of plants, obviously, because there's vegetation there. So it's a place where plants and animals live. It's also the natural world that is affected by human activity.
That's an interesting one.
Yeah. So it's the natural world or ecosystem that is affected by human activity. So it stands to reason that this is going to be an interesting move I'm going to make here. If there are no humans, can you have an environment?
I mean, that's an age-old question because we're so intertwined in, the natural world around us. And I think that there is an interesting juxtaposition, I guess, in worldviews that I want to describe at some point today, because there's something that I learned when I was in one of my master's programs that has stuck with me as far as worldviews on disaster theory. So I'm going to put a pin in that, though, for right now, and get back to it, because I want to define a couple more terms before we do that. So climate is the weather conditions prevailing in an area in general over a long period. So the climate is like the big picture weather systems and weather impacts, whereas weather is the state of the atmosphere at a place and time as regards to heat, dryness, sunshine, wind, rain. Like that's what the weather outside in your geographical area is. So there's a big difference between weather and climate. But a lot of times when we're talking about climate change or global warming, they're conflated. And so this is an intentional thing that particular political ideologies do on purpose in order to make it seem like climate change is not a real thing, even though 98% of scientists have said that it is.
Right. And I guess the example of climate and weather that I kind of want to bring up is one of my favorite places in the world, Port of Spain, Trinidad. The climate of Port of Spain, Trinidad is tropical. That's what it is, because it rains quite a lot and it's rather humid there. But the weather right today is probably 27 degrees Celsius or 81 degrees Fahrenheit. And I will tell you right now, I will trade 27 degrees Celsius for what you've got and what I've got here in North Carolina, because I could certainly enjoy myself in some nice Trinidadian sun right now. So weather, short-term, climate, long-term.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, for sure. And so with that in mind, like, what is climate change? What is global warming? Those are things that's like a phenomenon, I guess, that's driven by human emissions of greenhouse gases and the resulting large-scale shifts in weather patterns. So again, this is bringing things out from weather, your local weather, and out into sort of a broader sense. And I mean, it just means that the world is warming up, and there's a lot of implications that are going to cause a lot of issues. One, in particular, is it's increasing the frequency and severity of climate disasters. So weather events that cause disasters for us.
Okay. And what's interesting is part of what you said about global warming, many of these other issues, these are all part of a growing phenomenon called a climate crisis. Climate crisis happens when you have irreversible changes to the global climate. And many of these issues, like you so eloquently said earlier, like global warming, like increased weather, increased temperature, obviously, declining water supplies, soil erosion, droughts, insect outbreaks. These are all effects of the climate crisis that we're dealing with right now.
Yeah, and these are real things that impact people on a really large scale, and it's really scary to think about how many people are actually impacted by a lot of these weather events.
Yes. And one of the things we've talked about in a previous episode is food insecurity. And one of the effects of climate crisis is decreased crop production or decreased crop yield. And if you're constantly having soil erosion and poor soil quality, decreased water, and global warming, which means an increase of temperatures that can adversely affect the different types of vegetation that grow in a particular climate. There we are using terms again, climate. So you end up having to potentially change the types of foods that you could potentially grow because of the environmental conditions that have changed over a particular period of time. And then that could also contribute to other types of food insecurities. Because if you have a particular season that you know is based upon your climate, that you know is going to say, okay, hey, you know what, we can't grow in this, let's start saving up these potatoes, or let's start harvesting nuts, whatever you need to do. And now you have to make those adjustments because the climate has changed, then that's going to affect, quite honestly, how you live your life.
Yeah, and the upsetting part of that is when you're trying to adapt to a changing climate, I mean, we're not catching up very fast because of the agricultural industries that we have. You have to have several years in a row where your crops fail in order to realize how it has changed so much in the traditional, like, monoculture, conventional agricultural way. Like, people will still try and plant whatever they normally would plant for probably a couple of seasons beyond when they probably should be shifting that. And so when you were talking about food insecurity, I mean, that is a vast impact, like you said.
We've talked about this. We talked about it. And yeah, there's a lot to be said, and there's a whole lot more to be said about this entire conversation with the environment. And one of the ways that politicians are trying to curtail the effects of a climate crisis is the Green New Deal.
Yeah.
The Green New Deal. We've mentioned this before. And the Green New Deal is patterned after Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, which provided loads of social reforms and economic reform with different public works projects and different social projects. Now, the Green New Deal uses renewable energy and sustainability to achieve these goals. Now, part of the history with the Green New Deal came from the most recent Green Party candidate for the presidency of the United States, a gentleman who I'm proud to say I voted for, Howie Hawkins. And in the previous election, not 2020, but in 2016, the Green Party candidate for the presidency of the United States was a doctor by the name of Jill Stein. She was the Green Party candidate in 2016 and in 2012. And both of them ran on a Green New Deal, but they ran on a specific type of Green New Deal, and we'll discuss that in a few minutes. But Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, House Representative from the state of New York, and Senator Ed Markey, who is a senator from Massachusetts, introduced House Resolution 109 and Senate Resolution 59 to put the Green New Deal table. The Republicans in the Senate all said no. So Ed Markey's resolution went from, I think, there were no Republicans. I'm sorry, there were no, I think it was 57 to 0 to 57. So
Okay.
every single Republican said no. And every Democrat in protest voted with a present vote when it came to the floor of the Senate. Now, the Green New Deal has 5 goals: net zero greenhouse gas emissions, job creation, improved infrastructure, sustainability, and promoting justice and equity. And certainly, with the Joe and Cat Chats franchise, we are absolutely about number 5, promoting justice and equity.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's a really interesting one, as in regard to the Green New Deal, because if you're promoting justice and equity, what are we going to do about the military?
That's a great question. That's a wonderful question. And the specific type of Green New Deal that Howie Hawkins has supported, Lisa Savage, who's a state senator who ran for the state senatorial spot with the Green Party in Maine, Madeline Hoffman, who ran for the Senate, I think in 2018 in New Jersey, is a demilitarized Green New Deal. Now, Joe, what is a demilitarized Green New Deal? Number 1, we stop all the wars. Stop bombing people. That's wasteful. That's wasteful. Just don't bomb people. And when and wars, in addition to the physical violence and the emotional toll and the bodily harm and the damage to buildings and personal property, they're incredibly pollutive.
Yeah.
Wars. I mean, when you drop a bomb, there's all sorts of chemicals that go into the air. I was recently watching a documentary on DW, Deutsche Welle, which is a German news organization. And they did a wonderful documentary about people in Vietnam that are still suffering from the harmful effects of Agent Orange.
Yeah.
That's from the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War was 45, almost 50 years ago. And people are still dealing with the health problems from Agent Orange, which was a chemical that essentially destroyed vegetation, but was also highly carcinogenic.
Mm-hmm.
If you didn't have to tear down large swaths of land to bomb darker skinned people, that's, let's just stop doing that. Stop doing that. Let's use, and the people who are part of the military industrial complex, they're smart. There's some smart people in those companies. There's some smart people that work at Raytheon. There's some smart people that work at Boeing and Northrop Grumman. And if they can figure out how to drop a drone within a millimeter of its target from 5,000 miles away, they can figure out how to make a train move a little bit quicker. They can figure out how to make cars not use fossil fuel. They can figure out how to create long-haul trucking that doesn't spew thousands of tons of harmful emissions into the sky. So instead of using these military contractors to build drones and missiles and tanks and fighter pilots and fighter helicopters, let's have them use their technology and engineering expertise to further advance infrastructure and the environment. Let's have them fix roads and bridges. Let's have them replace our antiquated power grid, which completely fails every time there is a natural disaster. And by the way, guess what? Part of the reason why we probably have so many natural disasters is because of the way the environment is consistently deteriorating.
Yes.
So if you don't screw it up on the front end, there's a really good chance you won't mess it up on the back end either. So let's eliminate fossil fuel efficiency, because in many instances, and this is the next point I'm going to bring up, which is to ban fracking. In many instances, these military vehicles are using fracking fuel in order to go ahead and bomb people that we have no business bombing. Mm-hmm. Let's also eliminate the fossil fuel infrastructure. Think about how many large oil derricks are sitting in the middle of nowhere and are a bad storm or a cyclone or a couple of really strong waves away from causing a massive natural disaster catastrophe. not an event, because an event just merely sanitizes the level of destruction that is taking place. We're talking an actual catastrophe. Catastrophe. That's what we're talking about. So let's stop using fossil fuel, which is a whole other conversation that we had time to get into. But let's stop using fossil fuel. And the other goal with the New Deal that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ed Markey and others have proposed, they want to achieve these goals by 2050. That's too long. You can't do that. In 2050, no, I'll be dead by 2050.
Yeah, if things keep going the way they are. Yeah, let's put that to 2030. That's doable. 10 years is doable.
That's the goal. And that's the goal. That is the goal. Yeah. The goal of the Demilitarized Green New Deal is to have all of this completed by 2030. Now, people will go ahead and say, hey, yeah, I support the Green New Deal. But how are you supporting it? How are we, people say, oh, well, how are we going to pay for it? How are we going to pay for it? Well, there's a great way to pay for it. How about we defund the military, repurpose all of that engineering science into actually improving infrastructure, and then, well, wait a minute, what are we going to do with all these unemployed troops? Okay, guess what? They're going to be part of rebuilding this country because they were really good at destroying other people's countries. Let's have them rebuild our country. And while we're at it, let's go ahead and be good Samaritans and try to help rebuild other people's countries too. Because again,
sorry, my dog.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
Bro, it's okay. Come on, honest. Sorry, it's so loud. My apologies.
Otis caught me off guard too.
Yeah, it scares me every time he does that.
Otis caught me off guard too.
No. Lay down. You're okay. Okay.
All good.
Apologies. Oh my goodness.
No, it's all good. So, let's go ahead and stop bombing people. Let's go ahead and get rid of fossil fuel. Let's do this by the beginning of this next decade, by the end of this decade, which is 2030. And time is running out. The sea levels rising. We talked about in the Year in Review episode about 3.5 to 4 weeks ago, all the myriad natural disasters that took place. The Atlantic Ocean hurricane season that ran out of names, and that was 9 or 10 letters into the Greek alphabet with names. That's how many hurricanes we had. Look at the immense heat that we've had in so many different places. All of the wildfires in Colorado, British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, California.
Yeah. Brazil.
Australia. My gosh, Australia was cooking for a month. Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania was on fire. So let's really think about this. Let's really think about how we're thinking about being ecologically friendly and how we behave in our environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I totally agree, because this brings up a main point that I wanted to talk about today, which is how industry is so tied to capitalism, and capitalism based on exploitation. And all of these industries we're talking about, oil and gas, including things like mining, deforestation, agriculture, food industries, manufacturing, even like textiles, plastics, electronics, anything you can look around and see has been manufactured for the most part. All of this is sort of wrapped up in sort of the capitalistic exploitation of the environment. And that's how we've gotten to where we are today. And that's still the system that we're using. And you and I have been critical many, many, many times. This is episode 33. Like, we've been critical 33 times plus of the systems that we are upholding, because they're tied to systemic racism. They're tied to exploitation through capitalistic and gains, economic gains, and all of this is so sort of intersectional that it just comes down to the capitalistic post-colonial, well, I say post with quotation marks, colonial systems that are upholding the exploitation, point blank.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
No. I was part of what I was just thinking about while I was listening to you was we've talked about the history of slavery in the United States, and I've said on several occasions that racism is a function of economics.
Yeah.
And think about the way the United States was built. It was built off of agriculture. It was built
Yeah.
off of slave labor and farming, and that is an obvious and logical extension of capitalism and colonialism.
Yeah, exactly.
And I guarantee you that in many instances, the the indigenous people who were first here in the United States knew the proper farming methods. And I guarantee you the Africans that were trafficked into the United States knew proper farming methods. But there's a reason why all of those white folks in Europe ended up having to leave Europe and come to North America. Why? Because there were certain famines that were eventually killing people. There were famines and other types of diseases that were killing white folks. And they were like, yo, we can't deal with this. We can't deal with this. Look at the potato famine that took place in Ireland.
Yeah.
How did that happen? Okay, yeah, it was probably because of certain plant-based situations that caused all of the potatoes to not grow and or die. But I would certainly think that not knowing the proper farming techniques and not doing it in a sustainable manner also played a role in many of the famines that have taken place in Europe.
Yes, absolutely. And that brings up such a good point, because when we're talking about agriculture in particular, that's exactly what happened. The white settler Europeans came to America and they were like, sweet, a bunch of fertile land, let's plant it. And that ideology of how to farm is still what we use today, which is like our conventional agriculture is a monoculture, which means you plant one thing for a very, very, very large piece of land. And so the whole point of doing that is to get one plant that's going to feed, quote unquote, feed the world in various regions and whatever. Like, so all together in a globalized world, you would have a variety of foods to eat. But monocultures and monocrops have severe problems when it comes to the environment. You are basically planting one thing, so you're making a buffet for animals and critters and insects and all the things to come and eat your one thing. And so what do you do when all the insects come and eat your plant that you're trying to grow for yourself? Well, you put pesticides on them. Same with herbicides. Because other plants are like, sweet, this ground has been tilled, I can grow and be, fruitful. But if it's a something that's considered a weed, they're just going to put an herbicide on it. And these things are exacerbated, and these chemicals, guess where they come from? Oil.
Exactly.
These chemicals that are manufactured, which is also, an impact of the oil industry, mining industry, they end up in our water streams. And the biggest river that goes right through the US from Canada is the Mississippi River. It goes right down, and at the end of it, it drains out into the Gulf of Mexico, South Louisiana. And there's nothing that lives in that water now because of all the agriculture abuse of chemicals.
Absolutely. And to bring up something that we've talked about in 2 different episodes on the greatest podcast of all time, Joe and Cat Chats, and something that I've brought up on a couple of different conversations is Section 1881 Alpha of the Social Security Act. When we talk about environmental hazards, pesticides and herbicides are environmental hazards.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
If you live in an area that has been over-farmed with monoculture, and Monsanto goes ahead and sprays a couple of chemicals, and all of a sudden you have trouble breathing, or you have this weird rash on your arm, or your eyesight starts to go from 20/20 to 20/100. So, I can't see the way I used to. What happened? I started eating vegetables, and or I live around the corner from this farm, and things aren't the same. I think we need, again, environmental hazards as a result of pesticides and herbicides are a big problem. And when we talked about, from a historical perspective, about planning and land use, the farming was done on these plots of land that were 43,560 square feet. You know those plots of land as an acre.
Mm-hmm.
And then these plots of land that acres were divided into plots of sections that were 40 acres. This is why with the Freedmen's Bureau, when the Emancipation Proclamation took place, that all Black folks were promised 40 acres and a mule, which is also the name of Spike Lee's movie production. Now, that 40 acres is a smaller subdivision of a larger plot of land that is 640 acres. You know that as a square mile.
Yeah.
And the person that is responsible for what's called the North American Land Use System is none other than Benjamin Franklin. Now, Benjamin Franklin, in terms of crops and plants that he wanted to grow, he was like, you know what? Cotton's okay, but I'm far more interested in hemp. He wanted to grow hemp because he knew that hemp had a whole lot more uses than cotton, and it was going to be considerably more gentle on the soil and for the environment than trying to grow cotton. And then because of capitalism, a few really rich people that didn't want everybody else to benefit from the uses of hemp became a criminalized plant. Mm-hmm. And the byproducts of hemp becoming criminalized, obviously, are still extended to this day with marijuana. And when you think about drugs and punishment for particular drug possession and drug use, obviously Joe Biden wrote the crime bill, but a whole lot of Black folks are behind bars for dealing small nickel bags of weed. And all it is a plant. And the plant was criminalized because it was considerably more useful than cotton. And so I think that's something else that we need to bring into all of this when we talk about not only permaculture and monoculture, but what plants are a part of the permaculture and or monoculture.
Yeah, totally. And just to clarify for everybody, permaculture is sort of the opposite of what a monoculture is. It's where you integrate an entire ecosystem within a small piece of land, and you like mimic an ecosystem so that it produces more food for you in like a more of an ecologically sound way, because it's just mimicking a natural ecosystem. So you can manipulate that depending on your geographical location and climate.
We have a couple of comments here. I was saying, imagine how Laos is doing theirs 25 years of to work to remove UXOs still. I think the UXOs are the military devices that were like landmines.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, DDT was still legal when I was born. Like, I'm sure you might even remember that was still legal. Like, yeah, it's wild. It's such a horrible chemical, and we've learned a lot, but we're still using really horrible chemicals, and they're all primarily in the monoculture and conventional agriculture. They're primarily petroleum based, like chemicals. And when you were talking about sort of the hemp versus cotton debate or legislation, it reminded me of what's going on right now with oil, because big oil and big gas has very, very persuasive lobbyists, and have had for a long, long time, because there is a lot of money involved in oil. When we're talking about the legislation facilitating that, like it did with cotton, it's the same with oil right now. We rely so heavily on oil because that's what has been traditionally lobbied for, because a few people that are very powerful were getting very, very rich on oil. And so alternative energy sources were not explored, and they were not facilitated by our governments. And that's part of why we're in the situation we're in right now.
Absolutely. And to go along with the whole oil situation, let's not forget the power of oil lobbying in politics. The previous president, Donald Trump, his first Secretary of State was a gentleman named Rex Tillerson. And
Mhm.
if you care to guess what Rex Tillerson did before he decided to become a member of Donald Trump's cabinet?
I'm going to say oil.
He was the CEO of Exxon.
Ah, yeah.
Rex Tillerson. Now, how does a guy that goes from drill baby drill to being the head of the essentially United States Foreign Service and diplomacy? How does that happen? And what do you think the connections are between Foreign Service and all of the diplomats and the head of that department being a former CEO of Exxon? Where do you think that's going to be? Yeah, it's all about oil. Follow the money.
Yeah, oil. And one thing I wanted to mention is when we're talking about the extraction industries, I mean, something that I have thought about a lot because I used to work in a electricity company. They all have reclamation of land or regeneration departments, environmental departments, and these departments are based on the assumption that they're going to have to clean up a spill or, you know, do something that is going to have to recover the land from whatever the industry they're doing, which is typically extraction, oil, gas mining. And so this to me just doesn't make sense because what they're doing is they're putting a nice, lovely label saying we're, reclaiming the land, we're planting trees. After deforestation, there's an entire industry where people go and they replant trees where they've been cut down. And this is a band-aid solution. This is typically the reclamation is planting trees that are cheap. They are not the same trees that were cut down. For tailings ponds, for example, in the oil industry, in the tar sands in Alberta particularly, these tailings ponds, because they use so much water to extract the bitumen from the oil sands, this water is literally useless. So it gets put into a pond that's so toxic that nothing can, like, you literally just can't do anything for it. And so they also have to put these like towers that have bird calls on them so that the ducks and the geese and all the birds that migrate every year don't land in them because they die if they do. Yeah, it's horrendous. And this is, again, it just goes back to sort of the greed and the exploitation inherent in capitalism. Yeah, I mean, it's so ingrained in us and just normalized that it's really hard to talk about sometimes.
Kat, what are we doing as human beings? Really? Oh, come on. And I guess kind of going along with the tar sands in Alberta. I mean, obviously Alberta knows about this, and British Columbia knows about this. My younger brother lives in Spokane, Washington. There's a large logging community in those areas. You talk about mining and logging. These are more of these extraction industries that are incredibly harmful to the environment.
Yeah.
Not only do you waste a lot of the lumber that comes from chopping down trees, but you end up ruining an entire ecosystem because you decided to clear cut a particular area. There are birds that live in those trees. There are bears that hang out in those trees. There's all the different types of foliage that live on the floors of these forests. And when you come in and clear cut all of that, you destroy that area and you exacerbate soil erosion. Because when you pull out all of these trees and maybe you pull off the stumps, you're destroying the root system that keeps the ground solid. So when particular areas are more prone to, for example, landslides, well, there's probably a really good chance that they've done a lot of timber and clear cutting. And especially in Alberta and British Columbia, if you do a lot of clear cutting and you don't remove a lot of the dead branches and dried up branches and twigs, that as a result, guess what you end up with? Wildfires. And last time I checked, wildfires and all the smoke that they cause are actually, they're really bad for your environment.
Yeah, and health of not only humans but the animals and the entire environment around us.
That too.
Yeah.
No one wants to be breathing in smoke all the time.
No, it's horrible.
No, we got some more comments because people like to show up here. We got Merlin checking in saying, and Monsanto gets all up in it. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, Monsanto is one of the big agricultural companies that is giant and poisoning the earth.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
They have control of basically every aspect of agriculture, from seed to finished product.
Merlin saying hemp wasn't criminalized until 1970. Cannabis restrictions started in the early 1900s, with cannabis being regulated in 1930. Yep, then there's some truth to that. But in addition to that, I know Ben Franklin years ago was before he died, I think in the late 1790s or early 1800s, was a major advocate of growing hemp because he saw the multiple uses of growing hemp.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that you can do with hemp.
Exactly. Danny Michelle saying, oh boy, Alberta is so backwards. We're trying to bring back coal mining despite bills passed in the 60s saying you can't.
They are.
Yep. So they sold provincial parks to their friends so they can do what they want. That is shameful. And what's interesting about Canadian politics now more than ever is there's a lot of people that are pissed off with Justin Trudeau. And Joe Biden said, hey, this whole Keystone XL pipeline, we're not doing it. And there's a bunch of conservatives in Canada that are saying, hey, Trudeau, you better stand up to Joe Biden. You better do something about this. You better get this pipeline. And if you need to have sanctions against the U.S., we'll do it. Go for it. So it's going to be interesting to see what Trudeau actually does. Is he going to cave to corporate and capitalist interests, or is he going to say, hey, you know what, Canada is beautiful for a reason because we have all this wonderful nature and I like to keep it that way?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. I think I was talking to actually Merlin a few days ago about this, and because Canada's government owns the Keystone XL pipeline, they paid over $4 billion for it, and there's no vested interest in the U.S. anymore because we purchased it from the U.S. company. I don't think it'll ever get built in. And so, I mean, Canadians are not happy about that. That is for sure. And Trudeau's going to suffer because of that. And bye. I don't mind.
Yeah. We'll see what happens. But yeah, I'm concerned for the environment. For the environment, obviously. There's a lot to talk about. We still have more to discuss here because we have several.
Me too. Oh my gosh, I have so many notes. But one thing I wanted to kind of come back to is just when we're talking about all these industries and sort of how it's wrapped up in sort of the colonial ideology and capitalism particularly, I learned something when I was in my master's program, and in true form, just like Joe Nice, I had to pull out my disaster theory book. And so there are 4 worldviews in disaster theory. The first 2 I'm not going to pay much attention to. You can look them up on yourself. So the first 2 is the fatalist, which is basically just laissez-faire. The hierarchist, which is nature is to be sort of managed but considered considering the unintended consequences. Now, the 2 that I want to focus on is the individualist, which is a laissez-faire ideology where risks and environment in this ideology can be managed. So the sort of tagline of this one is nature is to be commanded. And then the opposite to that is the egalitarian, which is cautious integration in nature because risks and environment are unmanageable. So the tagline in that one is like, nature is wild, powerful, unmanageable, and can be unpredictable. So I thought it was really interesting when I re-looked this up that the individualist is titled that, because that is what North American culture is. We're so individualist.
We're selfish people.
We are laissez-faire. We want to control the environment. And that's basically the underlying assumption with all of these industries that we're talking about. We're trying to control the environment for our own gain because of this economy that we've made up for ourselves.
Yes. And it's propped up by Wall Street. And what Wall Street does, they make up money. And they don't provide any sort of real value to society.
Yeah, exactly. And so those of us who are sort of, trying to get a more of a community-minded society going, we sort of, I would say I'm a socialist. I would politically lean towards socialism. And so that means usually I want the government to set up social programs, for example, enable, equity through government programs, etc. Reparations, we've talked about, all sorts of things we've talked about a million times. But so government is just wrapped up in all of this because they're seeing the pull and push of industry, which is super powerful, and usually that's what wins because they have the most money for the lobbying. But one thing that government does do is what I was sort of looking into today is recycling programs, because that's a good thing that the government does. A lot of people are participating in this now. It's usually local government that implements policies and picks up your recycling every week. Vancouver is actually one of the most green, sustainable cities in the world, including other places like San Francisco, Copenhagen, Denmark, Singapore City, etc. And that's because of the recycling programs.
Sweden would also be on that list too.
Pardon?
I would also think Stockholm, Sweden would be on that list.
Yeah, I think so. And Amsterdam, and also there's like Vienna, Austria as well. Yeah, there's lots of cities in Europe that are. Whoops, that's a dog again. And so the interesting thing that I really wanted to point out is there's awesome things happening. People are recycling. They're taking that individual responsibility and, sorting their garbage now into recycling versus garbage. And then sometimes, people also have compost in the mix. But in 2018, January of 2018, so almost exactly 3 years ago, China stopped taking North American recycling. And that's been a very big issue because what used to happen is we would send all of our recycling over to China and they would sort it and burn the garbage or deal with the garbage and then recycle the stuff they could use. But that gave us a false sense of security in the sense that we are, we're doing the right thing by sorting our recycling. But most of that recycling ended up being burned, which is plastic. And that is, as everyone should know by now, very toxic for the environment. But we didn't see it because it was happening over in China. So now what's happening is most municipalities can't afford to have recycling programs. So it's mostly just ending up in the landfill now, even though you're still sorting it in your house. So
yeah, there's a whole lot to unpack there, and as I'm sure you and the viewers know, I've been to China 3 or 4 times.
Yeah.
The pollution in China is terrible, and it is as bad as you think it is when you watch it on TV. And you know it when you're flying, obviously in an airplane, and there are times when you can't necessarily tell if you're going through clouds or if you're going through a cloud of smog.
Yeah.
A cloud of pollution. And there are some days that I've walked around Beijing, China, and I've gone back to where I was staying in the hotel, and your eyes burn a little bit. You're like, why are my eyes burning? Why is my nose feel a bit irritated? Or why is there a bit of a tickle in my throat? And it's not from anything you've eaten or anything you've drunk or anything of that nature. It's the pollution in the So when people started wearing masks as a result of this COVID-19 pandemic at the beginning of around this time last year in the United States and other countries, I've been to China in 2019 and 2018, and I saw people actively walking around cities like Kunming and Shenzhen, Beijing, Chengdu, Shanghai, wearing masks. And I'm like, yo, why are they wearing masks? What's going on? COVID-19 or coronavirus wasn't in people's lexicon 4.5 years ago. But people were wearing masks back then in China. So the pollution obviously was a major situation in China. And I would imagine that much of that is not only due to burning, recycling, but it's also due to the lackadaisical environmental protections in the Chinese government.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's incredible, and it's not like the things that happen over there are, exclusively happening there. I mean, weather makes, wind is a thing. Those pollution or the pollution from those places in the world can end up anywhere else. There are, the ocean currents and the wind and weather and all the impacts all of the things. So contaminants can end up anywhere. So, and I know we're running out of time, and I have a couple other points to make. So I want to make them really quickly, but I just wanted to make it.
8 minutes left.
What's that?
About 8 minutes left.
Yeah, we got this.
Never any worries.
Yeah. So when we're talking about climate change, I just wanted to make it really clear that it disproportionately impacts women and children, disabled people, LGBTQ plus folks. And that is a really, really big issue. We also have things like climate refugees. 80% of people displaced by climate-related disasters are women and children, because women are disproportionately poor, have lower level education, lower income, and there's a hierarchy within that, which includes race particularly. And so they're not only more vulnerable to impacts of the climate change, but also face higher social, economic, political barriers than men, vastly underrepresented in decision-making levels of climate spaces, which is a big point that is really important when we're talking about government and policy. Disability makes more people more vulnerable to impacts of climate change because there's a loss of access to resources, difficulties in evacuation. Disabled people are more than twice as likely to live in poverty than non-disabled people. The LGBTQ plus populations are the most vulnerable in a disaster situation because though they are the most likely to have unstable housing situations. In the US, LGBTQ people make up 40% of the homeless population because they can't get housing. And it's also more difficult to cross borders as a trans person in an emergency, which leads me to a discussion of climate refugees, which are people forced to flee their homes and sometimes even their countries due to environmental disasters. And this is really hard to track because internally displaced persons or climate refugees, there's complexity involved because they are not covered under international refugee rights. So it's often not recorded. So they're saying that they're refugees because of something else. So that's a lot, I know.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot. And so when we're talking about this stuff, it means that we're, being intersectional, including feminism, particularly me, because I'm a feminist myself, an intersectional one. And then we think about how these things led to the environmental justice movement. Now, environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. I think people can probably assume that that's not really happening. There's not much justice going on in our countries or around the world as far as environmental justice. It's kind of low on the importance rating for most governments and policymakers. So the environmental justice movement was basically started by, the people that always start these incredible movements, which are Black women and Indigenous women. Through the years, it's been sort of seen as sort of a white, if you remember the Save the Whales campaign and Greenpeace, it's sort of remembered as sort of this white savior movement, but really it started because Black communities are disproportionately located close to environmental toxins, which we've talked about before.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so, I mean, there's a lot more to be said, but again, we're running out of time. So I just wanted to highlight
we have about 2.5 to 3 minutes left. And when you talked about, I guess, Greenpeace and white people, the white savior, I certainly think Fridays for Future needs to be discussed in the couple of minutes that we have left. And Fridays for Future is a global climate movement created by none other than a Swedish 15-year-old girl who's now 18 years old named Greta Thunberg.
Yeah.
And she was like, why are people ruining the environment? I'm going to do something about this. So I'm going to sit in front of Sweden's parliament every day until Sweden takes notice. She did that by herself for a while. Some of her friends from middle school and high school decided to. And then Sweden took action. They paid attention and they made changes to their environmental policies. So Greta Thunberg has been a 2-time Nobel Peace Prize nominee. She's the ripe old age of 18 years old. She is from Stockholm, Sweden. It's a city that is known for being ecologically friendly and a country that has a robust recycling program. I've been to Sweden on several occasions, and they're about their recycling in that country. So Fridays for Future movement is obviously important. Paris Agreement, we haven't discussed that yet, but we've got about a minute or two left. And the Paris Agreement is a legally binding international treaty for climate change. Quite honestly, the Paris Agreement doesn't do enough. It's not nearly as rigorous as it needs to be, and it's done in 5-year increments. The next Paris Agreement is taking place, I think, later this year. The United States has decided to rejoin the Paris Agreement with an executive order that Joe Biden signed on his first day in office, which was a week ago today. Yes, yeah. A week ago tomorrow. So the Paris Agreement works in 3 ways. It provides a framework for financial, technical, and capacity building, which is certainly important when you're trying to save the world from ecological and environmental disasters.
Yeah. And one thing is, we've talked about before, like the UN creates these beautiful, wonderful, inclusive documents, but there needs to be action that backs it up. And so I'm waiting for that. Thanks, UN. We appreciate, the beautiful documents, the agreements, whatever. But yeah, we need action to back it up, because Canada is also part of that. And Canada is one of the worst polluting countries as far as oil, the oil industry, and all sorts of things. And in our last minute, I'm going to just mention really quickly Autumn Peltier, who is a activist from Canada, an Indigenous activist who I think Greta Thunberg met at one of the events when she was in North America. She's a water activist, so definitely look her up. And including the Indigenous movements in the environmental justice movement is really important. So the NODAPL, we all remember that one, the Wet'suwet'en with the CostalGas Link pipeline. Look into 1492 Landback Lane, which is unceded land versus a housing development. Water justice, reservations don't have clean water. Flint, Michigan, Nestle and the Great Lakes. Please look up all of these things, because they're so incredibly important. And these are things happening right now that we need to be fighting for, because the environment isn't something we can exploit anymore. We need real change.
It's called Mother Nature for a reason.
Yeah, we need to respect her and nurture. Take one from her.
It's also called Mother Earth for a reason.
Yes.
She gave birth to all of this.
Yeah, she nurtures us. We need to nurture back.
Exactly.
Joe, Thank you so much.
Yeah, always. What are we going to talk about next week?
Oh my gosh, I don't remember.
Not only do I not remember, I'm not even sure I know, but next month is Black History Month.
Yeah.
So there's a lot we can talk about, and I'm sure we will come up with something in the next 7 days that's going to be worthy of our attention to us. Right?
Yes, we've got some exciting stuff coming, so stay tuned. And thanks for watching.
All right, everybody, we got to go. Peace.
Bye.